Have you ever had to hold back from giving someone a hug? I have, and it's the worst. Repression comes in all shapes and sizes. In simple terms, it's the act of restraining a feeling. Though it does have a negative connotation most of the time, it's not all bloodlust and sexual frustration. Different people repress different feelings for different reasons. Now this is where the neurologist Sigmund Freud and his theory on the human psyche comes in. I'm going to compare the psyche of two fictional characters, one from a romantic comedy anime and the other from a murder mystery gothic novella. One is a cute anime girl and the other is a repressed murderer, both deeply flawed. I'm going to show how repression is a coping mechanism to protect ourselves from the harsh lifestyles imposed upon us, whether it comes from family or society. The first character, the late Dr. Henry Jekyll, was a respected and humanistic doctor who also starred as the protagonist of the novel A Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. The thing about the protagonist is that he developed a split personality known as Mr. Edward Hyde. Now, Mr. Hyde was a hideous, deformed human being that expresses desires far from what is socially acceptable. The complete opposite of Dr. Jekyll, who was practically the embodiment of goodwill in everyone's eyes. Society in the Victorian ages, when the book was published in 1886, demanded that the people be constantly restrained and controlled and virtuous, since reputation was always at the top of the priority list. Now, where the concept of repression comes in is that Mr. Hyde was a physical manifestation of Dr. Jekyll's immoral desires that piled up through his years playing the part of a good, upstanding citizen. Life has thus become unbearable for Dr. Jekyll, as he was forced to pretend to be a good person to avoid the guilt that would otherwise follow any deplorable act he chose to commit as his other self. For Jekyll, the potion was kind of a way to be free from his misery. As Mr. Hyde, though, he held no compassion and no guilt, and this allowed the doctor to sleep peacefully at night, rationalizing his innocence by pinning all of the blame for his crimes on Mr. Hyde. Now, in this context of the story, the repressed it would be Mr. Hyde in all of his short, hideous, underdeveloped glory. The ego would be Dr. Jekyll in all of his miserable glory, and the superego would be the principle that image is everything that's been drilled into his head by society's social norms at the time. The second character, Kaguya Shinomiya, is the title character of the Kaguya-sama Love is War anime. She's a second-year high school student at Shuchin Academy, a member of the archery club, and the vice president of the student council. The thing about this protagonist is that she is a very cold and calculating individual who will go to excessive and sometimes even extreme lengths to manipulate a situation to her favor, the goal being to make her love interest confess to her. Also, what makes this a romantic comedy, is that the psychological warfare between the female and male lead, because they're both trying to make the other confess first. This craziness of hers is the result of emotional neglect and manipulation from her rich family's grooming to raise her as the next ruthless heir to the Shinomiya fortune. For example, on the first ever occasion she has of going to a fireworks display with a crush and a friend, her father, who raised her from afar, summons her to his estate, only to check if she's there and just walks away, not even bothering to go into the same room with her. Since this was the way she was raised by the people who were supposed to care and nurture her, it's no wonder she treats her love interest the same way. But the thing is, her cold and emotionless calculation that she hides behind cute antics is an internal mask that that she uses to protect herself from the emotional effects of her family's control and neglect. But her family's treatment of her also sheltered her from any negative emotional experiences that would lead someone to be so jaded. And the positive emotional experiences from her time outside of her household, like at school, with her Christian friends, contributed to the nurturing of the naive, sheltered girl that still values kindness and compassion deep inside herself. In the anime, we get to peer inside of her psyche, and we see that her superego is a literal ice queen, the perfect embodiment of the twisted morals her family pushed onto her. Her id is a good-natured moron who wants to receive the affections of her crush, and her ego is barely developed, as we see it depicted as a child, because her family's identity is more important than her own. Kaguya Shinomiya is a good person driven by her desire for affection and validation from her crush, who must repress that id because it's what's expected of her as a Shinomiya. In conclusion, Dr. Jekyll represses his id filled with immoral desires to cope with his superego, where lies the pressures of ideals imposed by society. As a result, Dr. Jekyll's ego is a miserable goody two-shoes who lashed out at the system that demanded absolute restraint by finding an unconventional way to act with absolutely no restraint. In contrast, Kaguya represses her id filled with desires of love and protects it with her superego to cope with her family's emotional abuse. As a result, Kaguya's ego is a bubbly and sweet child hidden behind the mask of a heartless girl.